Shadows of the past. Elizabeth Warner's life had been a mosaic of routine, love, and quiet joy. For over 30 years, she had been the devoted wife of Richard Warner, a man who had treated her with patience and respect, qualities she treasured deeply. They had shared a modest home in a small town, where their lives were simple but fulfilling. Richard had been a pillar in the community, a teacher at the local high school, beloved by students and respected by colleagues. His sudden passing the previous year had left a void in Elizabeth's life, so vast that it felt insurmountable. Elizabeth, now 58, found solace in her routine visits to Fairview Cemetery, where she could sit by Richard's grave and pour her heart out. It was as though the granite headstone, cold and impassive, was the last remaining piece of Richard's warmth, a reminder of the life they had built together. Every day, she brought flowers, fresh and fragrant in the spring, bold and resilient in the autumn. The ritual brought her comfort, a tether to the world she once knew, even as it slowly unraveled around her. On one overcast November afternoon, Elizabeth parked her car outside the cemetery gates, clutching the bouquet of lilies. The weather had turned crisp, and a chill lingered in the air. She buttoned up her coat and walked the familiar path, her steps slow and heavy. The cemetery was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional call of a distant bird. She liked it that way, quiet, peaceful, a place where her thoughts could drift without interruption. As Elizabeth approached Richard's grave, she noticed something peculiar. A small figure moved among the headstones a few rows away, almost blending into the somber landscape. She squinted, trying to make out the details. It was a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, with dark skin and curly hair pulled back with a simple pink ribbon. She wore a worn pink dress, the color faded but still cheerful against the backdrop of gray tombstones. Elizabeth watched in silent curiosity as the girl made her way through the rows, her movements purposeful yet gentle, as though she were visiting someone dear. The sight of a child in the cemetery was strange enough, but what puzzled Elizabeth more was the bouquet of white daisies the girl clutched tightly in her small hands. She moved slowly, her gaze fixed ahead, until she stopped in front of Richard's grave. Elizabeth felt her breath catch as she watched the girl kneel before the headstone. The child placed the flowers carefully at its base, her expression calm, almost reverent. She whispered something Elizabeth couldn't hear, then bowed her head, her fingers grazing the cool granite as though in a quiet act of respect. Elizabeth stood frozen, hidden behind a large oak tree. She felt like an intruder on a moment that wasn't hers to witness, yet she couldn't pull herself away. Who was this girl, and why was she here, visiting Richard's grave as though she knew him? Elizabeth's heart raced with questions, a mixture of confusion and an unsettling sense of invasion. This was her sacred space, her private mourning, and the girl's presence felt both mysterious and oddly intimate. Before Elizabeth could decide what to do, the girl stood up, brushing the dirt off her knees. She turned and walked away, her small figure retreating until it disappeared behind a line of trees at the far end of the cemetery. Elizabeth remained rooted to the spot, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. After a long moment, she finally gathered the courage to step forward and approach Richard's grave. The white daisies lay there, freshly placed, their delicate petals a stark contrast against the cold, gray stone. She knelt down, brushing her fingers over them, feeling an unexpected wave of warmth amid the chill of the afternoon air. "Who are you?" she whispered to the empty air, her voice barely audible. "And what connection do you have with my Richard?" Elizabeth stayed at the cemetery longer than usual that day, lost in thought. As evening began to fall, she reluctantly rose, said her quiet goodbye to Richard, and made her way back to the car, the image of the girl haunting her every step. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was nothing, just a young girl with flowers, a coincidence. But deep down, she knew there was more to it, a mystery that tugged at her heart in ways she couldn't ignore. The drive home was a blur. The usual landmarks, the library, the park, The small bakery where she and Richard used to buy cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings faded into the background as her mind replayed the scene at the cemetery. She parked in her driveway and sat for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Her house felt colder, emptier, as though Richard's absence had intensified. Inside, Elizabeth went about her evening routine on autopilot. She made herself a simple dinner, though she barely tasted it, her thoughts lingering on the young girl. She found herself staring at the empty chair across the table, where Richard used to sit, his presence a comforting fixture she hadn't realized she would miss so deeply. As she washed up, her gaze drifted to the window overlooking the garden. Richard had always taken pride in tending to it, filling it with vibrant flowers each spring. It had been his sanctuary, a place of peace. Elizabeth wondered if that girl, whoever she was, had known that side of him, the gentle man with a love for life's simple beauty. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Elizabeth retreated to the living room, where she sank into her favorite armchair. The walls were lined with photos of her life with Richard, their wedding day, vacations by the coast, their first house, a snapshot of him laughing as he held up a freshly caught fish. Each image was a reminder of the man she had loved, the life they had shared, and the void his absence had left behind. She reached for her journal, a habit she had developed in the months after Richard's passing. Writing was her way of processing the grief, a safe space where she could pour out her heart without fear of judgment. She opened to a fresh page and began to write. Today, I saw a little girl at Richard's grave. She brought flowers, daisies. She placed them so gently, as if she knew him. I don't understand it. I don't know who she is, or why she would visit him. But it felt strange, seeing someone else mourn him. It felt like sharing a part of him I didn't know existed. Her pen hovered over the page as she hesitated, then continued. Is it possible that there are pieces of Richard I never knew? Things he never told me. I loved him, but maybe there was more to him than I realized. She closed the journal and set it aside, feeling a mixture of sadness and curiosity. She couldn't shake the thought that perhaps, even after all these years together, Richard had harbored secrets, a part of his life she had never seen. The realization left her feeling both betrayed and intrigued, as though she were on the brink of discovering a hidden side of the man she thought she knew so well. That night, sleep came fitfully. Elizabeth drifted in and out, her dreams filled with fleeting images. Richard's face, smiling but distant. The girl in the pink dress, walking alone among the headstones. The bouquet of daisies lying at the base of his grave. Each dream left her feeling unsettled, as though a mystery was unfolding just beyond her reach. When she woke in the early hours of the morning, Elizabeth felt an unusual sense of determination. She couldn't explain it, but she knew she needed to return to the cemetery, to find answers to the questions that had begun to consume her. She dressed quickly, her movements purposeful, and left the house as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. As she drove, Elizabeth felt a surge of anticipation, mingled with fear. She had spent so much time mourning Richard, building him up in her mind as a man she had known completely, loved completely. But what if she had been wrong? What if there were parts of his life that she had never been a part of? The thought unsettled her, but it also sparked a flicker of excitement. She wanted to know the truth, whatever it was. When she reached the cemetery, she walked briskly to Richard's grave, hoping to see the girl again. But the cemetery was empty, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. She stood there, staring at the headstone, feeling a strange sense of disappointment. But she wouldn't give up. Elizabeth vowed to keep coming back, to wait and watch, until she found the answers she sought. Fragments of a hidden past. Elizabeth's morning visits to the cemetery became a routine over the next week, each day blending into the next as she watched and waited, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious girl who had so unexpectedly crossed her path. She tried to tell herself it was a fleeting moment, a chance encounter with no deeper significance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the girl's visit held meaning, that perhaps Richard's life had threads woven into it that she had never seen. Her curiosity grew more insistent, almost as if the girl's presence had opened a door to memories and questions she had long kept closed. She started asking herself things she had avoided since his passing. Who had Richard truly been? Had she, in her own grief and loss, romanticized him, losing sight of the complexities of who he was? She felt guilty, as if even considering these questions was a betrayal. But the image of that little girl lingered, a haunting reminder that there might be layers to Richard's life she had never known. One bright Wednesday morning, as Elizabeth sat by Richard's grave with her hands folded in her lap, she noticed a faint footprint in the grass beside the headstone. It was small, the size of a child's foot, pressed lightly into the damp soil from the previous night's rain. She knelt down, her fingers brushing over the impression, feeling the strange sense of connection to the unknown visitor. The girl had been here recently, perhaps even early that morning. As Elizabeth rose, she felt a resolve harden within her. She could no longer wait in silence, haunted by questions and suspicions. She needed to seek answers actively, to understand why this girl, this stranger, would visit her husband's grave. She didn't know where to begin, but her heart told her that there were clues scattered somewhere, pieces of a puzzle she would have to gather on her own. Her first step was to speak with Jane, her closest friend and confidant. Jane had known Elizabeth and Richard since their early days together, back when they were both young teachers fresh out of college. If anyone knew about Richard's life beyond what he had shared with her, it would be Jane. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth invited Jane over for tea. As they sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window, Elizabeth could feel her nerves fraying. How would she even begin to explain this obsession that had taken root within her? She fidgeted with her teacup, trying to find the right words. Finally, she looked up, her gaze steady. "Jane, I need to ask you something. It might sound strange, but did Richard ever mention anyone in his life that he was especially close to? Someone outside of our family, perhaps?" Jane raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Well, Elizabeth, that's a bit out of the blue. What's brought this on?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, recounting her encounter with the girl at the cemetery. She told Jane about the flowers, the quiet reverence with which the child had placed them, and the way she had disappeared into the distance, leaving Elizabeth with only questions. "I just can't shake the feeling that there's more to this," Elizabeth finished, her voice barely a whisper. "Richard was a wonderful man, but I feel like I didn't know everything about him. And it's unsettling." Jane reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over Elizabeth's. "Richard loved you dearly, Elizabeth. You know that, don't you? But people are complicated. Even in the best of marriages, there are always parts of ourselves that remain private, sometimes even to those we love the most." Elizabeth nodded, absorbing her friend's words, but the ache in her chest persisted. "I understand that, Jane. I don't know. This girl, she seemed like she had a connection to him. It's as if she knew him, truly knew him, in a way that I didn't." Jane took a moment to think, her gaze drifting to the roses Elizabeth had placed in a vase on the table. "There was a time, many years ago, when Richard mentioned someone. A former student, I believe. He had a soft spot for her, said she came from a difficult background, but was incredibly bright. He used to tutor her in math after school. I remember him speaking about her with a lot of compassion." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She had never known about this student. Richard had kept that part of his life private, never once mentioning it in their conversations about work. "Do you remember her name?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Jane shook her head. "It was so long ago. I'm sorry, Elizabeth. But perhaps you could check his old things. He kept records of his students, didn't he?" Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. She remembered the study, where Richard had kept boxes of papers, documents, and other keepsakes from his teaching years. She had left his belongings untouched, unable to face the memories held within those stacks of paper and dusty binders. But now, with a new purpose, she felt ready to delve into them. That evening, Elizabeth made her way to the study, a room she hadn't entered in months. The air was thick with the scent of old books and faint traces of Richard's cologne, a bittersweet reminder of his presence. She flicked on the light, illuminating the stacks of folders and boxes lining the shelves and floor. She closed her eyes, steadying herself, then began her search. She started with the older boxes, rifling through files of lesson plans, handwritten notes, and thank you cards from former students. Each paper felt like a fragment of his life, a testament to the man he had been. After nearly an hour, she opened a box labeled Special Cases, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the topmost folder. Inside was a list of names, annotated with dates and brief descriptions. She recognized many of the students he had spoken fondly of over the years, but her gaze stopped on a name she had never heard before: Nia Thompson. Next to her name, Richard had scrawled a brief note in his careful handwriting. Gifted, resilient, needs guidance. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she read the words. Was this the girl from the cemetery? She couldn't be sure, but the possibility stirred something within her, a sense of connection, of discovery. She needed to know more. She continued her search, and beneath the initial folder, she found an envelope containing a few photographs. As she thumbed through them, one image caught her eye. It was a candid shot of Richard with a young girl, her dark hair pulled back with a pink ribbon, a shy smile lighting up her face as she looked up at him. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 years old, and in her eyes, Elizabeth saw a blend of admiration and hope. Elizabeth traced her fingers over the photograph, her heart swelling with an unexpected warmth. This was the girl, she was sure of it. The same girl she had seen at Richard's grave. She felt a strange mix of jealousy and gratitude, as though she were uncovering a part of Richard's life that had belonged to him alone, a quiet kindness he had shared without fanfare or expectation. But why had he never told her? Elizabeth struggled to make sense of it. Richard had always been a private man, but she had believed they shared everything that mattered. The revelation left her feeling adrift, unsure of her place in the narrative of his life. The next morning, Elizabeth knew she couldn't let the mystery rest. She decided to seek out more information about Nia. She contacted an old colleague of Richard's, a retired teacher named Margaret who had taught at the same school and had always been close to him. Margaret answered Elizabeth's call with warmth and sympathy, her voice laced with the familiar sorrow of shared loss. After exchanging a few pleasantries, Elizabeth broached the subject gently, explaining her discovery of Nia's photograph and her desire to learn more about the connection between Richard and this young girl. "Oh, Nia," Margaret said, her tone softening with remembrance. Yes, Richard cared deeply for that girl. She was one of his brightest students, and he saw so much potential in her. But her life was difficult. Her mother was struggling, and Richard took it upon himself to be a mentor, a steady presence in her life. Elizabeth's chest tightened. She felt an unfamiliar pang, a sense of pride mingled with sadness. Richard had been a hero in quiet ways, a man who had given so much of himself without seeking recognition. Did he stay in touch with her? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely audible. "I believe he did," Margaret replied thoughtfully. Even after she left school, he kept in touch, helped her apply for scholarships. I think he even assisted her with a bit of financial support when she went to college. He never talked about it much. Richard wasn't one for boasting, but I could tell he cared deeply. Elizabeth thanked Margaret, her heart brimming with a confusing mix of emotions. As she ended the call, she felt closer to Richard, yet more distant than ever. There was so much she hadn't known, so many parts of his life that had existed in quiet shadows. Later that day, as she sat by his grave once more, Elizabeth held the photograph of Richard and Nia in her hands. She whispered to the stone, her voice trembling, "You were a better man than I even knew, Richard. But why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep this hidden from me?" As the wind rustled through the trees, Elizabeth closed her eyes, letting the memories of their life together wash over her. She felt a newfound determination take hold. She wanted to meet Nia, to understand the bond she and Richard had shared, to honor the legacy he had left behind. Elizabeth knew that her journey had just begun, and as she stood to leave, the photograph clutched tightly in her hands, she felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to understand, to find healing not just in her own grief, but in the connections Richard had woven into his life, and now hers. Threads of connection. The days that followed were filled with anticipation and a newfound purpose. Elizabeth couldn't shake the image of Nia from her mind, nor could she forget the realization that Richard had harbored this quiet kindness, this secret thread woven into the tapestry of his life. It stirred a strange mixture of emotions, pride, curiosity, and, unexpectedly, hurt. Richard had been everything she thought he was, and yet he had kept this significant part of himself hidden. Elizabeth struggled to reconcile the man she had known with the man she was discovering. Elizabeth's determination grew, and with it, the decision to reach out to Nia herself. She wasn't sure if Nia would even remember Richard, let alone want to talk to her, but she knew she had to try. She felt compelled not only by curiosity, but by a desire to honor Richard's memory in a way that went beyond her private mourning. She wanted to understand the impact he'd had on others, to see him through the eyes of someone whose life he had touched so deeply. Using the few details Margaret had shared, Elizabeth began her search. She found herself diving into local records and old school archives, looking for any traces of Nia's life after school. After hours of searching, she located a social media profile that matched Margaret's description of the girl, a woman now around 30 with a professional headshot and a small bio. Nia Thompson. Her profile indicated that she worked for a nonprofit organization focused on education in underprivileged communities, and from her posts and comments, Elizabeth saw a woman deeply passionate about her work. Elizabeth hesitated, her finger hovering over the message button. She worried that her reaching out might seem intrusive or strange, that Nia might not want to discuss someone she hadn't seen in years. But the pull was stronger than her hesitation. She took a deep breath and typed a simple message. "Hello Nia, my name is Elizabeth Warner. I was Richard Warner's wife. I believe you knew him during your school years. I'm sorry if this message is unexpected, but I would be grateful if you might have some time to talk. I recently learned of your connection with Richard, and I'd love to hear more about his impact on your life. He meant the world to me, and I hope to understand all parts of his legacy. Warm regards, Elizabeth." She sent the message before she could second-guess herself further. Her nerves prickled as she waited, feeling as though she had reached out into the void with nothing but hope that Nia might respond. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Elizabeth tried to distract herself with daily routines, but she found herself glancing at her phone every few minutes, her heart jumping each time it buzzed. That evening, as Elizabeth prepared a quiet dinner, her phone chimed. She hurried over to it, her hands trembling as she unlocked the screen. There it was, a response from Nia. "Dear Mrs. Warner, thank you for reaching out. Yes, I knew Mr. Warner very well. He was an important part of my life, and I've thought about him often over the years. I would be honored to speak with you about him. I can't express how much he helped me during a difficult time, and I'd be grateful to share that with you. Please let me know when would be convenient for you." Elizabeth felt a rush of relief and gratitude. She quickly replied, suggesting a meeting at a local cafe the next day. She could hardly sleep that night, her mind racing with possibilities, her emotions a tangle of anticipation and trepidation. She felt as though she were about to step into a new realm of understanding, one that might both comfort and challenge her in ways she couldn't yet predict. The next day, Elizabeth arrived early at the cafe, her hands clutching the small framed photo of Richard that she had brought with her, a candid shot of him laughing during one of their hiking trips. She wanted Nia to see him as she had known him, joyful, warm, and full of life. As she sipped her tea, she glanced nervously at the door, watching as patrons came and went. Finally, she spotted a young woman with dark skin, curly hair tied back neatly, and an air of quiet confidence that made her seem older than her years. Nia scanned the room, and when her eyes met Elizabeth's, she offered a warm, slightly hesitant smile. Elizabeth stood, extending a hand that Nia took gently, her touch both familiar and comforting. "Thank you for meeting me," Elizabeth began, her voice wavering slightly. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to. Well, to revisit the past." Nia smiled softly, her eyes warm with understanding. "Mrs. Warner, it's an honor to speak with you. I didn't know Mr. Warner very long, but he made a lasting impact on my life. He was like a guiding light for me when everything else seemed dark." They sat down, both silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the conversation they were about to have. Elizabeth felt a lump in her throat as she looked at Nia, wondering what stories lay hidden behind those calm, intelligent eyes. She braced herself, both eager and afraid to hear the truth. "He never spoke much about his work with me," Elizabeth admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew he cared deeply about his students, but I had no idea he'd been such a mentor." Nia nodded, her gaze steady. "Mr. Warner was the first person who truly saw me, who saw beyond my circumstances and believed in my potential. I came from a rough background. My mom was raising me alone, and we didn't have much. School was hard for me, not academically, but socially. I was different from the other kids, and I faced a lot of challenges. But Mr. Warner, he didn't just teach me math. He taught me how to believe in myself." Elizabeth listened intently, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Richard had always been kind, but to hear how deeply he had touched someone's life was overwhelming. Nia continued, her voice soft yet filled with emotion. "I remember one day after class, he asked if I was okay. I tried to brush it off, but he didn't let it go. He saw through the smile I was putting on for everyone else. That day, he told me that I was stronger than my circumstances, that I had a gift, and that the world needed people like me, people who had experienced hardship and could turn it into compassion." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes as she listened, realizing how many lives Richard had touched without ever seeking acknowledgement. "He must have cared for you a great deal, Nia," she said, her voice trembling. You were a part of his life that I never knew about." Nia nodded, her gaze growing distant. "He never made me feel like a charity case. He respected me, valued me. He even helped me apply to colleges, encouraged me to dream beyond what I thought was possible. And when things got rough financially, he found ways to support me without making me feel indebted. He was always there, steady, quiet, but unwavering." Elizabeth's hands tightened around her teacup, a bittersweet realization dawning. Richard had shared a profound connection with this young woman, had been her guide and mentor, someone she could lean on in times of need. And yet, he had kept it all to himself, a part of his life that had remained hidden even from her. The weight of this knowledge settled over her like a shroud, both comforting and alienating. "Thank you for telling me this," Elizabeth said, her voice breaking. "I always thought I knew everything about him, but I didn't know this side of him." Nia reached across the table, her hand gentle on Elizabeth's. "Please don't feel hurt by that. He spoke about you often, Mrs. Warner. He loved you deeply. He was a humble man, and he didn't want to burden you with what he saw as his personal mission." Elizabeth nodded, though the ache in her chest remained. She wanted to honor Richard's memory by understanding, by embracing every part of him, even the parts he had kept private. In doing so, she felt she could keep him alive in a new way, not as an idolized figure, but as a man, complex, compassionate, and quietly courageous. "Would you mind telling me more about yourself, Nia?" Elizabeth asked, hoping to strengthen the connection between them. "I feel like I know you, but I'd love to understand how Richard's kindness helped shape the woman you are today." Nia smiled, her eyes lighting up with gratitude. "Of course, after high school I went to college with his encouragement and studied social work. I felt this drive to give back, to be for others what he was for me. I work with kids from disadvantaged backgrounds now, helping them navigate challenges, encouraging them to see beyond their immediate circumstances. Every day I think about him, about how he believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Elizabeth felt a sense of closure beginning to form, a soothing balm over the wound left by Richard's absence. He had left a legacy, not only in her life, but in Nia's, and in the lives of those Nia now touched. It was as if Richard's kindness had rippled outward, creating an ever-expanding web of connection and compassion. As their conversation drew to a close, Elizabeth reached into her bag and pulled out the framed photo of Richard. She handed it to Nia, who looked at it with a mixture of joy and sorrow. "Thank you," Nia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for sharing him with me, for letting me carry a piece of him with me." They parted with a lingering embrace, a bond forged not by blood, but by love and shared memories. Elizabeth walked away feeling lighter, the mysteries of Richard's life no longer haunting her, but guiding her toward a deeper understanding of the man she had loved and the world he had left behind. The healing path. Elizabeth left the cafe that day with a mixture of emotions, grief, pride, and a strange sense of fulfillment. Her talk with Nia had uncovered a side of Richard she had never known, and while it had shaken her, it also comforted her in ways she hadn't expected. It was as though she had found a part of him that would continue to live on, a piece of his spirit that was woven into the lives he had touched. She no longer felt alone in her mourning. In a sense, she had gained an ally in her grief. Maya, this young woman who had been so profoundly shaped by Richard's kindness, was now a part of his legacy, a living testament to the quiet, unassuming man Elizabeth had loved. In the days that followed, Elizabeth found herself revisiting her memories with Richard with a new perspective. Every kind gesture, every moment of compassion, felt richer, as if she were seeing them all for the first time. She found herself walking through their house, touching the objects he had loved, the books he had cherished, the little knickknacks he had collected over the years. Each one told a story, not just of their life together, but of the man he had been. Someone who had given generously without expectation. Someone who had seen beauty in the smallest things. The following weekend, Elizabeth returned to the cemetery, carrying a bouquet of daisies. She chose them deliberately, remembering how Nia had placed a similar bouquet at Richard's grave. This time, though, she didn't go alone. She invited Nia to join her, hoping they might find a sense of peace in each other's company. Nia arrived at the cemetery wearing a simple dress, her curly hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked serene, though Elizabeth could see the faint traces of sadness in her eyes. They greeted each other quietly, a shared understanding passing between them as they walked side by side toward Richard's grave. When they reached the headstone, Elizabeth knelt down and gently placed the bouquet at its base. She ran her fingers over his name, tracing the letters as she whispered, "I'm still learning from you, Richard. Even now, you're teaching me how to love, how to give, how to let go." Nia placed a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. Together, they stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own memories of the man who had meant so much to them both. Elizabeth felt a profound sense of connection, not only to Richard but to the life he had left behind, a life that was still unfolding, still impacting the people he had loved. As they walked back toward the cemetery gates, Elizabeth turned to Nia, a question forming in her mind. "Do you think you could show me where you work?" she asked. "I'd love to see the place where you carry on Richard's legacy." Nia's face lit up with a smile. "Of course. I'd be honored. It's not much, just a small office and a few classrooms, but it's everything to me." The next day, Elizabeth met Nia at the youth center where she worked. The building was modest, tucked away on a quiet street, its exterior worn but inviting. Inside, the walls were adorned with posters of inspiring quotes, colorful artwork, and photographs of past events. The space had an energy to it, a vibrant, hopeful atmosphere that reminded Elizabeth of the classrooms Richard used to teach in. Nia gave Elizabeth a tour, introducing her to the staff and some of the students who were there for weekend activities. The children greeted her warmly, their laughter and excitement filling the air. Elizabeth watched them, feeling a pang of nostalgia as she thought of Richard and the years he had dedicated to teaching. This was his world, she realized. These young lives, these bright, hopeful faces. Even though he was gone, his spirit seemed to linger here, in the smiles of the children and the passion of the teachers who carried on his work. They ended the tour in Nia's small office, where a picture of Richard sat on her desk, tucked beside a stack of books and a vase of fresh flowers. Elizabeth felt her heart swell at the sight, touched by Nia's quiet tribute to the man who had been her mentor. "You've built something beautiful here, Nia," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "Richard would be so proud of you." Nia smiled, her eyes glistening. "I owe so much of it to him. He taught me to believe in myself, to see the potential in others. I think he'd be happy knowing that I'm trying to make a difference, just like he did." Elizabeth reached out, taking Nia's hand in hers. "You're doing more than trying, Nia. You're succeeding. You're honoring his memory in a way that would make any teacher proud." They spent the afternoon together, talking about their memories of Richard, sharing stories that made them laugh and cry. Elizabeth felt a healing warmth spread through her, a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. She had always believed that Richard's death had left an unfillable void in her life, but now she saw that his legacy continued, not just in her heart, but in the lives he had touched and inspired. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth found herself visiting the youth center regularly. She volunteered to help with reading programs, mentoring sessions, and art classes, finding joy in the connection she made with the children. Each time she entered the center, she felt a sense of purpose, as though she were carrying on Richard's work, breathing life into the values he had cherished. She no longer felt bound by grief. Instead, she was energized by a new mission, one that allowed her to give back to the community in the same way Richard had given to Nia. Her involvement in the youth center deepened her bond with Nia, and they quickly became close friends. Elizabeth found herself confiding in Nia, sharing stories about her marriage to Richard, the little moments of joy and humor they had shared, the dreams they had built together. Nia, in turn, opened up about her own life, her struggles and triumphs, her hopes for the future. They found comfort in each other, a shared strength that grew from their love for Richard and their commitment to honoring his memory. One rainy afternoon, as they sat together in the youth center's small library, Nia shared a memory that left Elizabeth speechless. "There was one time," Nia began, her voice soft with nostalgia, "when I was on the verge of giving up. I was in high school, struggling with everything: school, home, life in general. I felt like I didn't belong anywhere, like I was just lost. I told Mr. Warner that I was thinking about dropping out, that I didn't see the point in trying anymore." Elizabeth listened intently, her heart aching as she imagined the pain Nia must have felt. "Mr. Warner didn't lecture me or tell me what to do. He just looked at me, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, 'Nia, you are meant for something extraordinary. You may not see it now, but I see it in you. Don't let the world convince you otherwise.'" Nia's voice trembled, her eyes filled with tears. "Those words changed everything for me. For the first time, I felt like someone believed in me, truly believed. And that made me want to believe in myself. He gave me the strength to keep going." Elizabeth felt tears spill down her cheeks. Richard had always been a man of few words, but his words had weight, a power that went beyond anything she could have imagined. He had seen Nia's potential, had given her the courage to pursue her dreams, even when the world seemed against her. "Nia," Elizabeth whispered, reaching out to touch her hand, "he would be so proud of you. You are extraordinary, just like he said." They sat together in silence, the rain tapping softly against the windows, each lost in thoughts of the man who had brought them together. Elizabeth felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Richard's life, for his kindness, for the love he had shared with her, and for the legacy he had left behind. In the months that followed, Elizabeth continued her work at the youth center, finding joy and purpose in the connections she built with the children and the staff. She watched as the young people she mentored grew in confidence, saw their faces light up with hope as they discovered their own potential. She felt closer to Richard than she ever had, as though he were guiding her, urging her to carry on the work he had begun. One evening, as Elizabeth walked home from the youth center, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a peace she hadn't known since Richard's death. She looked up at the sky, the stars shining brightly above, and whispered, "Thank you, Richard, for everything, for loving me, for loving Nia, for giving so much of yourself." In that moment, she felt a warmth, a presence that seemed to wrap around her like a gentle embrace. She knew that Richard was with her, that his spirit lived on in the lives he had touched, in the love he had given, and in the purpose he had left behind for her to fulfill. Elizabeth returned home, her heart lighter, her spirit renewed. She knew her journey of healing wasn't over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. She had Nia, she had the children at the youth center, and most importantly, she had Richard's love, an enduring, unbreakable bond that would guide her for the rest of her days. A legacy of love. Elizabeth's life had transformed in ways she could have never predicted. Each morning, she awoke with a renewed sense of purpose, eager to see what each day would bring. Working with Nia and the children at the youth center had reignited a spark within her, something she hadn't felt since Richard had passed. Instead of the loneliness and sorrow that had once consumed her, Elizabeth now felt surrounded by warmth, community, and hope. The children at the center looked up to her, seeking her guidance and friendship. She found herself sharing stories of her own life, lessons she had learned, and snippets of wisdom she knew Richard would have imparted to them as well. She could see glimpses of him in her actions, in the gentle encouragement she offered, in the laughter she shared with the children. It was as if he were there with her, helping her carry forward his legacy of kindness and compassion. One morning, as she arrived at the center, Nia greeted her with a wide smile and an excited glint in her eye. She held a small envelope in her hand, which she handed to Elizabeth with a sense of ceremony. "What's this?" Elizabeth asked, looking at the envelope curiously. "Open it," Nia replied, barely containing her excitement. Elizabeth tore open the envelope carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Her eyes widened as she read the letter, her heart swelling with emotion. It was an invitation from the city council. The youth center was being recognized for its contributions to the community, and they were being honored with a Community Impact Award. In addition, a small grant was being awarded to the center to help fund new programs and resources for the children. This is amazing," Elizabeth exclaimed, her eyes misting over as she looked up at Nia. Nia nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "This wouldn't have happened without you, Elizabeth. Since you joined us, the kids have felt a new sense of hope, a warmth that fills this place every day. I truly believe that Richard is working through you, that he's guiding us toward this success." Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. She had joined the center out of a need to honor Richard's memory, but she had never imagined that her involvement would have such an impact. She hadn't realized how much she had given to this place, to these children, until she saw the joy in Nia's eyes and felt the gratitude in her heart. "We'll have to celebrate," Elizabeth said, a smile spreading across her face. "This isn't just about the grant. It's about the lives we're changing, the hope we're bringing to these children." As the day went on, Elizabeth found herself lost in thought. The award felt like a validation, a sign that she was on the right path. But it was more than that. It was a reminder that Richard's legacy was alive and thriving, that his love and kindness continued to ripple outward, touching lives even after his passing. Later that week, the city held a small ceremony to honor the youth center's work. Elizabeth and Nia attended together, standing proudly alongside the other staff members as they accepted the award on behalf of the center. Elizabeth felt a quiet pride as she listened to the mayor speak about the center's impact, about the lives they had touched, and the hope they had inspired. When it was her turn to speak, Elizabeth stepped up to the podium, her hands trembling slightly. She looked out at the crowd, seeing the faces of the children she had come to love, the community members who supported their work, and most importantly, Nia, who stood in the front row with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for this honor," Elizabeth began, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotion. "This center is more than just a place for children to learn and play. It's a place of healing, of growth, of second chances. I joined this center because I wanted to honor the memory of my husband, Richard, who spent his life helping others. He was a man who believed in the potential of every child, who saw hope where others saw obstacles, and who gave without expecting anything in return." She paused, her gaze drifting upward, as though she were speaking directly to Richard. "Richard taught me that kindness is a seed we plant in the hearts of others, and that with time, it grows into something beautiful. This center, this community, is a garden of kindness, a place where the seeds he planted have flourished." As she stepped down from the podium, the audience erupted in applause. Elizabeth felt a profound sense of peace wash over her, a reassurance that Richard's legacy was in good hands. She knew that his spirit was with her, guiding her every step of the way, and that she was exactly where she was meant to be. In the days that followed, Elizabeth noticed a shift in herself. The weight of grief had lifted, replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer haunted by the absence of Richard, but instead inspired by his presence, by the love and strength he had left behind. Her life was no longer about mourning what she had lost. It was about celebrating what she still had: the memories, the love, and the legacy that she and Nia were carrying forward. One day, as Elizabeth and Nia were sorting through donations for the center, Nia turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Elizabeth, I've been thinking, would you consider sharing your story with the kids? About Mr. Warner, I mean. I think it would mean a lot to them, to hear about the man who inspired this place." Elizabeth hesitated, feeling a pang of vulnerability. Richard had always been a private man, and she had held their memories close to her heart, protecting them like fragile treasures. But as she looked into Nia's earnest eyes, she felt a sense of responsibility, a desire to pass on the lessons she had learned, to ensure that Richard's legacy would continue to inspire others. "That's a wonderful idea, Nia," Elizabeth replied, her voice soft. I think he would want me to share his story, to help these children see that kindness can make all the difference." The following week, Elizabeth gathered the children in the center's small library. They sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces filled with curiosity as they waited for her to begin. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she looked at the eager young faces before her. "Today, I want to tell you about a man who changed my life, and the lives of many others," she began, her voice gentle yet steady. "His name was Richard Warner, and he was my husband. Richard was a teacher, a friend, and a mentor to those who needed him most. He believed in kindness, in seeing the potential in others, and in giving without expecting anything in return." The children listened intently as Elizabeth shared stories of Richard's life, his passion for teaching, and his unwavering belief in the goodness of others. She told them about the time he had stayed late to help a struggling student, about the countless hours he had spent mentoring young people like Nia, and about the quiet ways he had supported their community without ever seeking recognition. As she spoke, Elizabeth felt Richard's presence beside her, a comforting warmth that filled her with strength. She realized that sharing his story wasn't just about honoring his memory. It was about inspiring a new generation to carry forward his values, to become beacons of kindness and compassion in a world that often needed it most. When she finished, the children applauded, their faces alight with admiration. One young boy raised his hand, his eyes wide with wonder. "Do you think we can be like Mr. Warner one day?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. Elizabeth smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I believe you already are. Every time you show kindness, every time you help someone in need, you're carrying on his legacy. Richard would be so proud of each and every one of you." In the months that followed, Elizabeth continued to share Richard's story, weaving his lessons into her daily interactions with the children. She saw the impact of his legacy in the small acts of kindness they shared with each other, in the way they encouraged one another, in the friendships they built, and in the hope they nurtured within themselves. As spring arrived, Elizabeth felt as though she were blossoming alongside the flowers in Richard's garden. She spent her weekends tending to the garden he had loved so much, planting new seeds, watching as life emerged from the soil. She felt connected to him in a way that went beyond words, a love that transcended time and space, a bond that would never fade. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elizabeth sat on her porch, gazing out at the garden. She felt a deep sense of peace, a quiet understanding that Richard was with her, guiding her, encouraging her to keep moving forward. She closed her eyes, letting the gentle breeze wash over her, a soft whisper in the wind that seemed to say, "Thank you." In that moment, Elizabeth realized that her journey was far from over. She had found a new purpose, a new path that honored Richard's memory, a life filled with love, kindness, and connection. She knew that she would continue to carry his legacy forward, not only for herself but for the children, for Nia, and for everyone whose lives he had touched. Elizabeth smiled, her heart full, her spirit renewed. She was no longer defined by grief, but by love, a love that had blossomed into something extraordinary, a legacy of kindness that would live on for generations to come. A new beginning. As spring turned into summer, Elizabeth found herself fully immersed in the life she had rebuilt, one that honored Richard's memory while allowing her to grow and embrace her own passions. The youth center had become her second home, a place filled with laughter, hope, and warmth. Every day, she felt Richard's presence guiding her, his influence evident in every child she mentored, every smile she encouraged, every small victory she celebrated with them. She had become a central figure at the center, a mentor, a friend, and for many, a surrogate family member. One morning, Elizabeth arrived at the center to find a surprise waiting for her. Nia stood near the entrance, a broad smile on her face, holding a large, carefully wrapped package. The children gathered around, their faces alight with excitement, whispering among themselves, clearly part of the surprise. "Elizabeth," Nia began, her voice filled with warmth, "we all wanted to thank you for everything you've done for us. For the center, for the kids, for me. You've given so much of yourself, and we wanted to give you something in return, something that shows how much you mean to us." Elizabeth looked at Nia, her heart swelling with affection. She hadn't expected any recognition, any gifts, for the work she did. To her, this place, these children, and this newfound purpose were gifts in themselves. But as she looked into the eager faces surrounding her, she felt the depth of their gratitude and love. "Thank you," Elizabeth murmured, her voice choked with emotion. She took the package from Nia, her fingers trembling slightly as she carefully unwrapped the layers of paper. When she lifted the lid, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a beautifully framed portrait of Richard. The painting captured him in a candid moment, his face alight with the kindness and warmth she had loved so deeply. His eyes sparkled with that familiar twinkle, his smile gentle and full of compassion. But there was something else in the painting, too, a subtle hint of wisdom, as if he were looking beyond the present, beyond what was visible, seeing something deeper and more profound. Elizabeth felt tears spill down her cheeks as she traced her fingers over the frame. She couldn't find the words to express what she was feeling. It was as if Richard were there with her, a presence as real and comforting as the day they had first met. "How did you?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. Nia placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I spoke to a local artist who specializes in portraits. I told him about Richard, about the work he did, the lives he changed, and the legacy he left behind. He captured him from the stories we all shared. And she added, a soft smile on her face, "I also shared a few photos you let me borrow. I hope you don't mind." Elizabeth shook her head, unable to speak, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She hugged Nia tightly, overwhelmed by the love that surrounded her. She realized, in that moment, that this was Richard's true legacy, not just the lives he had touched, but the love and community he had built, a bond that continued to strengthen even after his passing. The portrait found a special place in the youth center, hanging in the main hallway where everyone could see it. Each time Elizabeth walked by, she felt a surge of pride, a reminder that she was not alone in her mission. Richard's spirit was there, guiding her, reminding her of the love and compassion that had defined his life. As the summer wore on, the youth center began preparing for its annual summer festival, an event that brought together the entire community to celebrate the work they were doing. This year, Elizabeth was tasked with organizing it, a role she accepted with both excitement and a hint of trepidation. She wanted it to be perfect, a celebration not only of the youth center but also of Richard's legacy, a reflection of the values he had cherished. The weeks leading up to the festival were filled with planning, organizing, and a flurry of activity. Elizabeth coordinated with local vendors, arranged for live music, set up booths for games, and organized a talent show featuring the children. The energy at the center was electric, the kids buzzing with anticipation as they practiced their performances and prepared their crafts to sell. On the day of the festival, Elizabeth arrived early, overseeing the final preparations. She walked through the grounds, admiring the colorful decorations, the vibrant booths, and the stage set up for the evening's performances. As she moved through the crowd, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment, a joy that went beyond anything she had ever experienced. She had helped create something beautiful, something that brought people together in celebration and hope. As the sun began to set, the festival reached its peak. Families laughed and danced, children showed off their talents on stage, and friends gathered around tables, sharing stories and memories. Elizabeth stood back, watching with a quiet pride, her heart filled with gratitude. She felt Richard's presence, his warmth and approval, as if he were standing beside her, sharing in the joy and love that filled the air. Toward the end of the evening, Nia took the stage, a microphone in hand, as she addressed the crowd. "Everyone, I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone very special," she began, her voice strong and clear. "This festival, this center, and everything we've accomplished here wouldn't be possible without the dedication and love of Elizabeth Warner." The crowd turned to Elizabeth, applauding, their faces filled with admiration and appreciation. Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush, her heart racing as she tried to hold back her tears. Elizabeth joined us in honor of her husband, Richard Warner, a man who believed in kindness, compassion, and the power of community. Nia continued, "But she has given us so much more than that. She has become a part of our family, a mentor to the children, and an inspiration to all of us. Elizabeth, thank you for everything. We love you." The crowd's applause grew louder, and Elizabeth felt herself swept into a sea of hugs, handshakes, and kind words. She felt a profound sense of belonging, a realization that this community, this family, was something she had helped build, a place where she was truly home. As the evening wound down, Elizabeth found herself alone by the portrait of Richard in the hallway. She gazed at it, her heart full, her spirit at peace. "We did it, Richard," she whispered, a smile spreading across her face. "We've created something beautiful, something that will last. Your kindness, your love, it's all here, in every child, every smile, every hug." A soft breeze drifted through the hallway, carrying with it a sense of warmth and comfort, as though Richard were wrapping her in his arms, assuring her that he was proud, that he was there, watching over her. In the days that followed, Elizabeth continued her work at the center, but with a new sense of purpose. She knew that this was where she was meant to be, that her life had come full circle, that she was fulfilling the legacy Richard had left behind. She no longer felt haunted by his absence. Instead, She felt empowered by his presence, a guiding light that would forever illuminate her path. One evening, as she sat with Nia and a few of the children around a campfire, Elizabeth looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of completion, a quiet peace that resonated deep within her soul. She thought of all the lives she had touched, the love she had shared, and the legacy she had built, and she knew that this was just the beginning. Elizabeth's journey of healing, of self-discovery, of love and loss, had brought her to a place she hadn't known existed, a place where grief and joy, sorrow and love, could coexist, creating a tapestry of life richer and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. As the fire crackled and the children laughed, Elizabeth closed her eyes, letting herself be enveloped by the warmth of the flames, the love of her new family, and the enduring presence of the man who had started it all. "Thank you, Richard," she whispered into the night, "for everything." In that moment, she felt his answer, a gentle whisper carried on the breeze, a promise that she would never be alone, that love, once given, never truly dies. And with that assurance, Elizabeth leaned back, her heart full, her spirit free, ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that she was, finally, home.